Why most Vikings never went raiding. When you imagine a Viking, you probably see a warrior standing at the front of a longship. He carries a shield. An axe hangs from his belt. Behind him, dozens of men prepare to cross the sea, attack a distant settlement, and return home with silver, weapons, and stories of glory. It is one of the most recognizable images in history. But it represents only a small part of the Viking world. Most people who lived in Scandinavia during the Viking Age never attacked a monastery. They never crossed the North Sea in a warship. Many of them may never have seen a large raid being prepared. Their lives were spent somewhere far less dramatic. On farms. Behind fishing nets. Inside workshops. Beside fields that had to produce enough food before winter arrived. So why do we remember an entire society as raiders when most of its people probably never went raiding? To understand that, we first need to leave the longship and walk back toward the farm. The Viking Age lasted roughly from the late 8th century to the middle of the 11th century. During those centuries, the population of Scandinavia was spread across rural communities, small settlements, farms, coastal villages, and a limited number of growing trading towns. Most families depended directly on the land. They planted crops, raised animals, gathered wild foods, fished, repaired buildings, made clothing, produced tools, and prepared supplies for winter. This was not a quiet life. It was physically demanding, highly organized, and constantly vulnerable to bad weather. A poor harvest could affect an entire household. Animals needed enough fodder to survive the cold months. Roofs had to be repaired. Grain had to remain dry. Meat, fish, and dairy products had to be preserved before they spoiled. There was always something that needed to be done. And if too many people abandoned the farm at the wrong moment, the consequences could be serious. A raid was not simply a spontaneous adventure in which every man in a village grabbed a weapon and ran toward the nearest ship. It required planning. A seaworthy vessel had to be available. Its hull needed maintenance. The sail and ropes had to be prepared. Food and water had to be collected. A crew had to be organized, and someone powerful enough to lead the expedition had to bring the entire operation together. Longships were remarkable machines, but they were not cheap or simple objects. Building one required timber, iron, rope, textile production, skilled craftspeople, and thousands of hours of work. Even after the ship was completed, it still needed a crew large enough to sail, row, navigate, guard supplies, and operate together under dangerous conditions. That placed major expeditions beyond the reach of most ordinary individuals. The people most capable of organizing them were usually rulers, wealthy landowners, local magnates, or ambitious leaders with access to ships, resources, and followers. For these elites, raiding could be extremely useful. Foreign silver could reward loyal warriors. Valuable objects could be displayed, traded, gifted, or melted down. Successful expeditions could strengthen a leader's reputation and attract more followers. Raiding was therefore not only about stealing wealth. It was also a political investment. A leader who returned with silver could distribute it to the people supporting him. A leader who returned with nothing might lose prestige, allies, and influence. But the crew beneath that leader was not necessarily made up of full-time professional warriors. Some participants may have been farmers, craftspeople, traders, or fishermen who joined a voyage temporarily. This is one of the most important differences between the Viking world and its modern image. A man could work on a farm for most of the year and still participate in an expedition when circumstances allowed it. He did not need to spend every day as a warrior to join one raid. But joining even once was risky. The sea itself could kill a crew long before it reached another shore. Storms, cold, damaged equipment, navigation errors, disease, and food shortages could end an expedition without a single battle. And arriving successfully did not guarantee a safe return. Local communities learned to defend themselves. Rulers constructed fortifications, organized armies, controlled rivers, and guarded wealthy targets. A raid that appeared profitable could quickly become a disaster. For an ordinary farmer with land, animals, children, and responsibilities at home, the possible reward had to be weighed against everything that could be lost. That helps explain why most people stayed behind. But staying behind did not mean they were disconnected from raiding. Every expedition depended on a much larger society that never boarded the ship. Someone had to grow the food carried aboard. Someone had to spin and weave the enormous woolen sail. Someone had to make rope, forge rivets, shape wooden planks, repair shields, preserve fish, sew clothing, and care for the farms while others were away. The famous warrior standing on the longship existed because dozens of less famous people supported the world behind him. Women often managed major parts of the household economy, particularly when men traveled. They supervised food stores, textile production, domestic work, animals, and other responsibilities required to keep a farm operating. Children also worked from a young age, learning the agricultural, domestic, fishing, and craft skills their households needed. Older people carried experience that could determine when to plant, when to slaughter animals, how much food to store, or whether the weather made a journey too dangerous. The Viking ship may have carried the raiders, but the farm made the voyage possible. There is another reason the warrior became more visible than the farmer. The people attacked by Scandinavian raiders were often members of literate Christian societies. Monks and clerics recorded attacks on churches and monasteries because those events were terrifying, disruptive, and important to them. The Scandinavian farmers quietly harvesting barley at home were far less likely to appear in those written records. As a result, many surviving accounts show us the Viking Age from the perspective of its victims. Those sources are extremely valuable, but they naturally focus on the people arriving with ships and weapons, not on the much larger population remaining in Scandinavia. The raiders became historically loud. The farmers remained historically quiet. Archaeology gives us a broader picture. The remains of longhouses, tools, barns, workshops, fishing equipment, cooking vessels, textile tools, animal bones, and cultivated fields show a society built around production, agriculture, skilled labor, and trade. Even objects that looked like weapons could have ordinary uses. An axe was valuable in combat, but it was also essential for cutting wood and constructing buildings. A knife was not proof that its owner was a warrior. It was an everyday tool. Expensive swords, elaborate horse equipment, and high-status weapons appear in only a minority of graves. They belonged to a world in which wealth and military prestige were unevenly distributed. Not every Scandinavian owned a sword. Not every household owned a ship. And not every person had the freedom or resources to leave home. Viking Age society also included people who were not free. Enslaved individuals performed agricultural, domestic, and craft labor. Some had been captured during expeditions or traded across long-distance networks. Their work supported households and elites, but they did not control where they lived, what work they performed, or whether they traveled. This reminds us that the wealth brought home from raids had a human cost, and that the Viking world was not an equal society united by a single warrior identity. It was divided by wealth, status, gender, family connections, and freedom. So were the Vikings farmers rather than warriors? That question creates another false image. The Viking world contained farmers, sailors, traders, craftspeople, settlers, enslaved laborers, political leaders, and warriors. Some people moved between several of these roles during their lives. Trade and raiding could even happen during the same expedition. A crew might arrive peacefully where trade was profitable and use force where resistance appeared weak. Ships carried timber, furs, textiles, iron, food, silver, people, and many other forms of wealth across enormous distances. The same maritime technology connected Scandinavian farms to markets stretching far beyond northern Europe. Raiding was real. It could be violent, profitable, and historically transformative. But it was never the complete Viking story. The majority of people lived within local communities where survival depended on farming, fishing, animal care, craft production, trade, and cooperation. They did not spend their lives searching for monasteries to attack. They spent them preparing for winter. And perhaps this is the real reason the stereotype has survived. Warriors create dramatic stories. A longship crossing a dark sea is more exciting than a family repairing a roof. A raid can be described in a single frightening paragraph. A harvest requires months of repetitive work. But without that harvest, there would be no stored food. Without textile workers, there would be no sail. Without shipbuilders, there would be no longship. And without thousands of ordinary people remaining at home, the small number who went raiding could never have left at all. The most famous Vikings may have crossed the sea. But the Viking world was built by the people who stayed behind.